We welcome those who are watching us virtually, even as we have this group that is here. This afternoon, we want to look at the church as a custodian. The church as a custodian. And we are going to look at the church being at the forefront of ensuring that the moral, the ethical, the societal values that are expected in a nation are observed. And we start by asking ourselves, where did this start? How do people of God get involved in matters politics? Where did it start? And it starts at the very beginning when God called Moses to politics. Because Moses was comfortable being a herdsman, but then God, in Exodus chapter 3, verse 7, said to him that he had seen the misery of his people who are in captivity, and he wanted him to go there because some values were being abused. People were enslaved, they were in bondage, so some intervention was required. So we would say that could be a beginning of people of God getting involved in the politics of the day. And you know, Moses had his reservations. He didn't want to get into active politics. He had excuses. He said he wasn't a good orator. Therefore, he couldn't use the mic properly. But then he was told, I'll give you assistance, but you have to get into the thick and thin of the politics of the day. Later on, after Moses had engaged in politics and engaged the king and people had been set free, he speaks to people before he exits in the book of Deuteronomy, and he says to the judges, these are the people who are given responsibilities, so they are the politicians, the leaders of the day. He is telling them, you judges, hear the disputes between your people and judge them fairly. Note the word, judge them fairly. Meaning then that the people of God must ensure that public matters are administered in a fair way. And Moses tells the judges, this just way of learning matters should not just be in regard to the Israelites, but even foreigners. You must not show partiality in judging. Hear both small and great alike. Do not be afraid of anyone, for judgment belongs to God. Bring me in a case too hard for you. That's Moses. We're saying that in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 16. And then it goes on and on in the Old Testament. The people of God getting actively involved in the politics of the day, not to take positions necessarily, but to give guidance on what leaders should have, on the values that the leaders should have. I am sure all of you know about Prophet Nathan, who confronted the king in 2 Samuel chapter 12, and told the king, yes, you are king, but you have not executed your duties very well. You are king, but you have not allowed fairness. You have committed murder and also committed adultery. So it's a call to the leader to be straightforward in leadership. And then later on comes Prophet Elijah, the Tishbite, and he confronts King Ahab, who has grabbed land and caused murder, of course with the assistance of the first lady. Yes, we said that we should be fair to both gender. Yes, the king has committed, he has grabbed land, assisted by the first lady, and the prophet confronts the king and tells the king, look here, man, things are not good. Much as you are the leader, there is judgment, there is condemnation. So it's a call to fairness. Even if you are king, even if you are in the first family, you should practice fairness. This is the man of God who is calling upon the king to do that. Prophet Isaiah, one of our major prophets in the Old Testament, is also talking about fairness in leadership. In Isaiah chapter 3, verse 14, he says that the Lord enters into judgment against the elders and leaders of his people. And he tells them, it is you who have ruined my vineyard. The plunder from the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by clashing my people and gliding the faces of the poor? This is the prophet saying what the leaders are not doing right. He is not talking to the ordinary people. He is talking to leadership and telling leadership, our expectations as people of God, the expectation of God is that you should not be corrupt. You should practice fairness. We can go on and on in the Old Testament. But then, one very important thing was done by Samuel himself. You know, Samuel was a prophet, at the same time he was a judge. So he was both a leader and also a prophet. He is the leader of Israel for a while until the people of Israel demand for a king. And graciously, or was it not graciously, he handed over. He was a bit reluctant to hand over. He explained the dangers of having a king, and people would say he didn't want to leave power. That's why he was saying, you know, when you get a king, you'll go through these challenges, your daughters, your sons. But then he handed over. And at the point of handing over, he has very good handing over notes. If you read the book of Samuel, where he says, now that you have a king and a leader, as for me, who is handing over, I ask you to testify against me in the presence of the Lord and his anointed. When I was your leader, whose ox have I taken? Whose donkey have I taken? Whom have I cheated? Whom have I oppressed? From whose hand have I accepted a bribe to make me shut my eyes? You know, this is a person who is handing over. And he is saying, this is the standard. That when you get into leadership, you must not get engaged in grabbing. You must not get engaged in corruption. And at the end, when you are handing over, there should be an exit, an exit interview sort of, where you say, as I'm saying now, that you didn't get involved in monkey business when you are in leadership. This is what this guy is saying, that look, I was in leadership and I served my country with fairness. This tells us that the people of God, the church that is, must keep these standards for the leaders in this country and mark them as they hand over at any point. MCAs, senators, MPs, governors, president. We should, as a people of God, by what Prophet Samuel taught us, we should mark them and even encourage them to have handing over notes. Praise be to God. Yes, ask them now, you're handing over, we already have some standards set here by the prophet. Can you stand before us so that we may testify against you? Because this is what Samuel said, testify against me. And in your testifying against me, say, whose ox have I taken? Say, which hand have I taken a bribe? Whom have I oppressed? These are the standards that we must set. These are the standards that we must hold all the way. We also know that in the New Testament, John the Baptist also was very keen to check on those who are in authority. You know, he didn't hold back to charge those in leadership that they must live beyond reproach. You remember him preaching, as he waited for Jesus Christ to come for baptism, he conducted preaching, and he talked to many people, and among those he talked to were the soldiers who were there. And They asked him, now what should we do? These were people in authority, because soldiers were people of authority then, and even today. And he spoke to them and told them, you people, I would be happy if you'd be contented with your salaries. That's the measure. You have to be contented with your pay. So again, don't cut corners, don't receive bribes, because you are in authority. It's likely when you are in authority to abuse office, to do things that you feel enrich you. So this is a man who was speaking against people, who was guiding people who are in authority to execute clean business. And again, you know how his story ended. There was a confrontation between him and with the king, King Herod. He spoke against his conduct, and he was putting him into account, telling him, you cannot do unlawful things. You cannot do irregularities. It is not light. This is John the Baptist telling Herod. Oh, the consequences were disastrous. I don't know whether the church is ready to pay such price, because John the Baptist ended up being beheaded. Wow, that's what transpired. But that is evidence within Scripture that the people of God must hold leadership into account. We have seen it happen in the Old Testament. We are seeing it in the New Testament, that the people of God are holding those in leadership to account. They do not close their eyes and say, that does not concern us. They do not close their eyes and say, we have spiritual business to conduct. They are part and parcel of what is happening in the society. But the question now is, how can the church reposition herself as a moral conscience of the nation? How would the church reposition herself as the moral conscience of the nation? One, it has to start with cleaning itself. The church has to start by cleaning itself. Remember again, Samuel is speaking as a leader, as a political leader, and as a religious leader. So for us to be part to be active in being custodians of the morals and the values of the society, we have to start with ourselves. You remember the story of Achan in the book of Joshua? Something went wrong, and the Israelites could not win. Then they realized the problem is not with our enemies. The strength is not with our enemies. The weakness is within. Because Achan hadn't misbehaved. I don't want to go into the story, Joshua chapter 7. Achan had misbehaved, and that's why they could not win against a very small city called Ai. So God told them, get back to yourselves. Put things in order within yourself, and then you'll manage to go against others. So as a church, if we are to hold our leaders to account, we have to make ourselves good for that task, as the Israelites did in regard to Achan in Joshua chapter 7. So let's not hold back. Where we are required to make things clean within ourselves, let's do it. Brothers and sisters, let us sanitize within. Praise be to God. Let us sanitize within, so that as we go out, we'll be strong. We'll have moral authority and command to handle what will go against. Because when the Israelites did the sanitization, by dealing with the case of Achan, they were able to go against Ai, and they won. As a church, we have to win by proper sanitization and social distancing from evil. Remember also the case of Ananias, Mr. and Mrs. Ananias, in Acts chapter 5. This was trouble within, and they dealt with it. Again, there was sanitization. Because if they didn't deal with Mr. and Mrs. Ananias, then how do they confront the rest who may be involved in corruption, embezzlement? How would they do it? Or maybe they would have protected Mr. and Mrs. Ananias and said, huyu ni mwizi wetu. I've heard that language somewhere. Huyu ni mwizi wetu. So we don't touch him or her. But they didn't do that. They dealt with Ananias because that would give them confidence as the witness to others. Another issue arose in Acts chapter 6 when some people within the church complained that relief was not being distributed fairly within the church. Some people complained, some women complained and said, no, there is relief in this house of God, but it's not being distributed fairly. The readers did not take that as bad politics. Suppose these women were in my church. Maybe I would have excommunicated them. They are bringing trouble in the church and called them drama queens. But we find that the church holds the bull by the horns. The apostle said, let's do a clean up. I think these women are speaking sense. I think we do not have time to share the relief in the church. Why don't we get assistants? So that as we handle prayer and preaching, our assistants can handle relief. So another cleanup within. And this gave the church strength and confidence to go out and witness. And that is one thing that we must do as a church. If we are to become the custodian of the society, which we are, of course, but we must ensure that we do it within so well so that anybody who would wish to fault us have nothing to say against us, have nothing to accuse us on. We must therefore as a church resist compromise, because we can be compromised even through dirty money. And once we receive the money, it will be difficult for us to be custodians. So if we want to remain custodians as the church has always been, we must ensure that we keep off where we are compromised. I know sometimes it's difficult because money given in church is sometimes difficult to ascertain its source. I know that. But again, we shouldn't be seen to be encouraging those with dirty money to come and sanitize it in church. And not really sanitize the money, but sanitize themselves. We should encourage. I know it's an issue on debate about do we receive it, do we not receive it? No, who knows the source? Do you ask for the source of every money? I know it's difficult. But salvation is not easy. So we are not called to easy salvation. We are called into a salvation that is complicated, and that's it. We have to raise some of these issues as much as we can. As church, we need to be united and speak in one voice. If we want to be custodians of society, we have to try as much as possible and speak in one voice, so that we are not seen to be taking positions that are divergent, even unnecessarily. We must be courageous. If we are to be custodians, we must be courageous. Remember Prophet Nathan going to tell the king a story. You can imagine how that moment was. I don't know whether he had told his wife and children the confrontation that was ahead of him, because his family would have discouraged him. Please, thus says the Lord, but you have a family. Going to tell the king about things that he has not done right will cause us a lot of trouble. You are not the only prophet. So, people of God, we have to be courageous.
Yes, you do.
To be custodians is a dangerous venture. It's a very dangerous venture. Make sure you have your insurance renewed. It's a dangerous venture. But it is, again, we are mandated to do it.
Yes.
We have no way out.
Yes, we are.
The only way out is to leave the church. Yeah, if you do not want to be the custodian, then please tender your resignation. Keep off from the church, because it's a calling, but it is dangerous. And finally, we have to avoid being unnecessarily partisan. Because when we take sides politically, we aligned ourselves to a certain political formation, we can never be custodians. So there are values we hold as church. If at some point our values agree with a political group, thanks be to God. But we do not belong to that political formation, at least as a church. As individuals, that's different. But as a church, we cannot belong to a political formation. Because when you take sides, it becomes difficult when that political formation does what is not right. How do you condemn them? How do you speak truth to power when you are part of the power? How do you speak truth to a political formation when you have been part of it? So I would ask that as much as we can, not to be partisan. Yes, we work together with our leaders, but in order for us to point out and be prophetic, we must ensure that we do not become partisan. And there are cases in history of people who have done it and done it well. All of us remember Archbishop Desmond Tutu, how he managed it in South Africa during the difficult days of apartheid. He spoke truth to power. But if you read, I've been reading his book, Made for Goodness. And he narrates how he also spoke to the Africans when they went wrong. He did not hesitate to tell them, these are excesses. Much as you are the oppressed, much as you are on the receiving end, you cannot do this. He would speak to them on many, many occasions to caution them not to embark on excesses. And you remember the words of Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said that black supremacy is as dangerous as white supremacy. Black supremacy is as dangerous as white supremacy, because they were undergoing the supremacy of the whites. But he was telling the blacks, it doesn't mean that when we uproot the whites, we take over the excesses. Otherwise, we will end up in the situation of Animal Farm by George Orwell. You know, you take over from men. That time it was men. You take over from Mr. Jones, who owned the farm. You know, you overthrow him and establish an animal kingdom. Then gradually, the animals become human. Gradually they become human, and they start having rules changed, some at night, some in the morning. So the rule that you read last night, when you read it in the morning, it's different. All animals are equal. That's where it had stopped. But by the following day, it was, but some are more equal than others. So when we take up that responsibility, we must ensure that we protect everybody. We speak for everybody, and we speak against what is not right. So the South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu did it very well. He's an open book to the church, that he was able to be a custodian. The church of his time was able to be a custodian during very difficult times. He spoke truth to the government, the apartheid government, but also spoke truth to the people. We also know what the Roman Catholic Church did in the Philippines when change was needed. They did not shy from taking their place as expected of them. And they really assisted the people. The people could go and, expect from the church when they needed to be taken forward. We also know about the second liberation in this country. There were great clergymen in their simple ways. They took up their prophetic role. It was not easy, but they took up their prophetic role. And one thing they ensured is that they had nothing that could be raised against them, as I had said earlier. They ensured that there was nothing that could be raised against them because those days were difficult. The Constitution allowed the government of the day to put people, rather to detain people without trial. There was also an official harassment. You could just disappear. Yes, but these guys knew that, well, if they come for me, I have been living a life that cannot be faulted. So, while we focus on the church being the custodian of morals, the custodian of the ethics and societal values, we are not asking for what is not ours. It is what has been there throughout history. God has been involved in politics, and actively so. No wonder he's called the King of Kings. That's politics. The King of Kings. Therefore, when the church gets involved in commenting, making statements on the morality of the nation and the leaders, on the ethics and the values of our leaders, it's not trespassing. It's doing what its calling is. And the other question would be then, would the church be expected to champion appointment of leaders with sound moral foundation? Would the church be expected to champion for the appointment of leaders with sound moral foundation? You already got the answer. If Samuel talked about himself as morally upright, he was saying, this is the standard for leaders now. Anybody who aspires to high office, this is the standard. And as I said earlier, exit him or her. When they are leaving office, particularly the governors now who have done their term, let us exit them as Samuel exited himself. Amen. Praise be to God. Amen. Yes, and the president is also exiting. We also need to exit him through the same standard. But I said, if we are to exit anybody with those standards, we also have to be of standards ourselves. And that's why Joshua had to deal with Achan. That's why the early church has to deal with the cases of Ananias and Sapphira and dealt with them in a very bold way. Therefore, my call upon the church is that the calling to be custodians of morals and being the conscience of society is not far-fetched. It's not outside our jurisdiction. It is in line with scriptures. It is in line with church history. It is in line with church tradition. That calling, we can't run away from it. And if you start a church, that wants to keep off from that, then that's not a church. If you want to have a church where you will not talk about those things that are called politics, then that's not a church at all. It is something else. Number 2, self-sanitization. When we are doing our recruitments, when we are doing our own appointments, let's get it right so that nobody points a finger at us. Let's be very prayerful, like they did when they were replacing the late Judas Iscariot. They went into prayers. Yes, they went into prayers and then they conducted voting. And they opened the servers. So everybody could see that the election had been done fairly. So our own elections, are we conducting them fairly? Our own appointments, are we conducting them fairly? Can we open the servers of our church elections? Can we? I hear men and women saying, yes. We can open the servers of the Presbyterian Church of East Africa. We conducted our elections in April, and we didn't have anybody going to court, within or without. So I think that's not very bad. That's not very bad. I can only speak from where I come from. I will challenge the others here. Bishop Ogide had it over. So I'm sure the servers were opened at his place. And others as well. So if our servers can be opened, then here we can take up our role as called upon by God to point fingers. Not to point fingers in accusation, but to point fingers to assist those who are in political authority. And not just in matters election, in everything we do. Because when it comes to you getting active in pointing out what is not morally right, what is not of value, you are engaging in a very dangerous business, as I said. Therefore, you must make sure that your church or your organization has done things right. Because when you point a finger at others, they are likely to remind you what you also did not do right. They will tell you, Bishop, moderator, you say we should do it right. Did you do it right in such and such a place? And maybe there are things you didn't do right. They were captured on camera and put somewhere in a freezer. You can't remember that they ever happened until you speak, and then they are produced as evidence against you. And they will tell you now, look, you say you are a follower of Prophet Samuel, who never took up bribes, who never took anybody's livestock. But look at this photograph, and it's not on Photoshop. Look at this guy who looks like you. What are they doing here? And then you have nothing but to go quiet and say you are misquoted because you didn't really mean that, you meant something else. But then the people, the deaf people of the media did not hear you properly. And then they misquoted you. So let us ensure that we are prayerful so that as we get engaged in what we have called all along, being custodians of the moral, ethical, and societal values, there's nothing raised against us. There's nothing that can be raised against us. When we say leaders should meet a certain threshold, they will not point at us and say, wait a minute, what is the threshold in your church? Did you observe it? Why do you want us to observe it, yet you people never observed it? So, going forward, even as we get in 2022, let us take up our responsibility. Let us take up our place.